Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks so much for the last couple of days. This event on feminism and the politics of childhood was just so wonderful, so stimulating, and various people here were at it. So thank you very much for making it a third day as well, and great to have such a full room. This title, Developments in Deconstructing Developmental Psychology, I hope it's not too self-centered a title, in the sense that I given the august assembly of people here, would like to treat it as a bit of a consultation about whether some of my arguments still work, and further formulations of them. I want to say that the question of deconstructing, developments in deconstructing developmental psychology poses the question of whether it's a redundant enterprise. In the first edition of the book, I expressed the hope that it would be, irrelevant quite soon, and there seems to be, I think, no sign of the irrelevance of developmental psychology. I mean, that I want to sort of bracket the question of what a proper developmental psychology could be, but certainly in some of the needs to critique the current forms of it, it seems to me, are still current. But I need to hedge that claim alongside an understanding that there are, specifically different forms of developmental psychology that function in particular contexts, and therefore they give rise to different kinds of evaluations and critiques. And so I wouldn't want to sort of make blanket statements about the whole of developmental psychology, because that's clearly impossible. However, there are particular forms of developmental psychology of the kind that circulate here in the UK and from North America, that I think globalize, that because of their very significant reasons of influence, of cultural imperialism, if you like, they inscribe many wider practices around international development, both individual models of individual child development, and even and those are, I think, also carry reflections of broader models of international economic development. So there's a kind of covert globalization of what we might want to argue are in fact very local particular norms and practices, which have their class, gendered, racialized, regulatory and pathologizing effects of the kind that Rachel was just talking about. And I would, I think, argue that there's plenty of that still around. Now, in terms of conceptual resources, you can probably already hear that I draw on Foucauldian ideas. They've been very influential in critiquing some of the forms of psychology, and the rise of individual psychology that's also in some sense aligned with developmental psychology, particularly in this country. And I think that psychoanalysis has been a continuing resource for critiquing forms of sort of rational empirical psychology in the British tradition. There are other kinds of psychology that are already psychoanalytic that need other kinds of tools to critique them, in fact. So again, I wouldn't want to universalize that as a critique. But there are also others. There are from social cultural historical theory, geography, now post-human approaches. All of these kind of, I think, are usefully destabilizing the preoccupation of modern developmental psychology with the individual singular child. And now we have those kind of arguments being made. I've just put Africa Taylor, Monica Flegel's kind of recent books that make the connection between the child, the human, the animal, the environment, that I think are very relevant. And for me in particular, there are important influences that come into play from feminist theory, gender studies, queer theory, and indeed, whether for better or worse, I've resisted putting a kind of separate chapter on gender development and so on in deconstructing developmental psychology, because it seemed to kind of ghettoize the sort of the critique that belongs throughout the text. In many ways, it's very much a feminist critique rather than deconstruction. And also disability studies, I think, is a very relevant, relatively new discipline. So my book, Deconstructing Developmental Psychology, that came out in '94, it was very much formulated to be a countertext, an alternative to the kind of big glossy textbooks that kind of get circulated for certainly psychology students and make their way into other kinds of disciplines, education, social work, now childhood, early education, so on. And as a text, it kind of was aiming to perform rather than actually sort of elaborate what a deconstruction of developmental psychology was through that familiar genre of the textbooks. And so just to say that my book, Developments, that came out sort of alongside as a companion volume to the second edition of my book, was very much more a kind of conceptualization of what might be involved in a deconstruction and some further reflections on that. And I was absolutely sort of thrilled and overwhelmed that the special issue of Feminism and Psychology in summer 2015 that Sarah has a piece in kind of explore what the relevance or what the applications of those kinds of arguments are now, and in a way that take those arguments beyond anything I would have envisaged into other domains. So I think that's probably the most gratifying thing that could ever happen, to see a set of arguments that are certainly, I would say I was popularizing rather than inventing, but being reworked and reformulated into a range of other domains. So over that period of time, and I am now working on a third edition because the publishers have said if I don't do it, they'll get someone else to do it, which is kind of a bit. I've kind of institutionally, I've moved from a psychology department into an education institute of education, as it's called now, and that trajectory has not only been via a sort of feminist, but by being involved in a women's studies program. Getting very inspired by a lot of discussions in development studies and post-colonial theory that kind of I thought were incredibly useful for critiquing ideas about child development. And of course now there's childhood studies. So that's one kind of key development, if you like. Another development is the huge, I think, intensification of individualization that's taken place under the forms of late capitalism that we call neoliberalism, and that have taken two kinds of strands. We could say there's a sort of a feminization process going on around people call the emotional literacy, the rise of affective capitalism in a post-industrial context, alongside psychologization. That I think, some of those arguments that we were making in the sort of 1980s and 90s around the rational unitary subject of psychology, and now requires some reworking because that norm is the now much more a creative relational subject of feminized, casualized, precarious work. So the kind of core questions that I thought I'd bring today are really to think about sort of in reflecting on what the current discussions are about what needs to be deconstructed, if you like, or critiqued in the applications and formulations of developmental psychology. What's the same, what's more of the same, and what's different, if you like. That's the way I've organised the rest of this presentation, and then I kind of, if we've got time, would like to try a bit of an example out on you to see if it works. So what's the same? Well, psychological culture there's nothing new about that since since the beginning of psychology in the beginning of the 20th century. that process of psychologization, the creation of certain kinds of normalizations around the identities and activities of mothering, of parenting, of forms of family functioning, the pathologization of the poor, etc. I think that seems to me very much the same now. Though we've got more and more engagement with attachment theory going on, and in the second edition I was asked to put more in, and the third edition I've been asked to put yet more in on attachment theory, and of course now we've got that sort of increasing neuroscience emphasis coming in to rework attachment theory in this new era of fMRI scanners, etc. And we've got, I think, the same concern with early intervention, if not more, the idea that if the earlier you can see something, the more you can change its trajectory, or what Elena Levin, amongst others, called a developmental fallacy, that you could actually see or redefine what was going to happen later by virtue of what you saw earlier. And we've got a lot of stuff happening, I think, around what used to be called risk, that moves from environments in its original formulation. It's the same with notions of vulnerability, originally an environmental or sort of spatial concept that's been increasingly privatized, individualized, attached to individual bodies. And in terms of what's more of the same then, it seems to me, well, we've got the sort of a kind of logic that Jan de Vos, a Belgian researcher, has kind of traced through, a sort of logic of psychologization that eventually gets to evacuate the psyche. In the end, there's no psyche left because it's all bypassed through neuroscience. And we see that in the discourses around brains rather than minds. And we've got an increasing focus on the optimization, these terms that we use now to talk about neoliberalism, optimization, maximization, and all with a focus on being flexible and agile, as well as increasingly responsible, the active, agentic model of citizenship, etc. And arguably that individualization has been at the expense of destroying networks of solidarity, collective subjectivity, the claims about the demise of working class identifications and so on, through the aspirational discourses of hardworking families and this active entrepreneurial subject and citizen. We've got the intensification of the regulation of mothering that many people are now writing about, entrepreneurial mothering, as Deborah Thornton puts it, and Val Edwards and others sort of highlighting in their work on parenting culture the cruel optimism of this claim that you can endlessly improve, and what's cruel about it is, of course, that if those improvements don't happen, you've only yourself to blame. And Matthias Cordero, as they're talking about developmental legalism, I think in the sort of connections between developmental psychology and the law, I think it's a useful, very useful analysis. So so we've got more of the same, I think, in all the discussions around early intervention. More and more on attachment. We've got connections between risk, the discourse of vulnerability, and connected increasingly to ideas about abuse, so that victim and survivor identities are very much sort of formulated, proliferating, especially with the explosion of at least discussions around child sexual exploitation. We can't say, well, it's not clear that there's more now than there was, but there's certainly more discussion about it. And of course, some of the disclosures are historically situated. And we have to think about what this says about the dominant cultures, that this whole kind of focus on abuse. whether it's sort of from all the revelations about Jimmy Savile and the whole culture of what was called light entertainment. I mean, those discussions in, I think, London Review of Books, very interesting. You know, what does it mean that the purveyors of our light entertainment were abusers of children to, you know, on such an almost industrial scale? And that's a very local example, but, you know, we know there's very widespread global context for the sexual exploitation of children. Alongside this, it seems that, you know, the kind of state responses to demand more and more regulation, more castigation of social workers, etc., more demands on therapists to report, etc., and on universities, for that matter, reporting and all kinds of things, that's likely, in terms of disclosures around abuse, to silence children and young people. I mean, just the current issue of the International Journal of Child's Rights has got this article from New Zealand, I think, saying that actually these processes of mandatory reporting are going to make it, young people feel they're less likely to report rather than more to adults if they think they're going to have to report on. So what's different? Well, I think the rise of the resilience discourse, I mean, I don't know, what's the same, what's different? Resilience started, the discussions around resilience started in the 1980s, didn't they? But there's a lot more of that around now, taken up in a number of very interesting directions that seem to be migrating from, well, both from environments to people, and then from you know, gendered in particular ways, in discourses of grooming, and now it's being moved into discussions around radicalization and so on. We're going to see it go on and on and on. We've got the return of notions of character, which kind of has a sort of quite a sort of conservative moral flavour about it, conservative with a small c as well as a big, I think. And that interesting notion of character, because it seems quite stable, seems to be a counterweight or a condensation perhaps of, as I was thinking about it, this notion of the flexible subject. We've got all the, you know, maybe it's different that we've got legalization of gay marriage, civil partnerships, we've got loads more discussions around, well, what we now call transsexuality, lots of things, lots of discussions and lots of consideration around questions of migration, refugees, the intensification and multiplication of notions of diversity to what the linguists and migration studies people call super diversity. We've got the whole problem of global warming that's gradually getting wider circulation, if not action, in the discourse. And we've got kind of some other developments around the gendering of discussions of international development and poverty alleviation that perhaps have shifted from gender and development or gender in development to now, in some sense, fetishizing the girl child as the saviour from poverty in general, which is attracting, so I think, you know, some interesting critical attention. So is it different or not? I mean, we've got the digital age, we've got discussions around being born digital, discussion around digital families. But on the other hand, you know, as Angel Gordo Lopez has recently argued, that if you look closely at some of these discussions, they still return the responsibility for regulation and promotion and computer literacy and online security to families in ways that re-articulate traditional notions of who's responsible and who's at fault when things go wrong. So in that sense, it's not so new. We've got the sort of proliferation, escalation of discussions around bullying, whether it's online or not. But bullying is interesting. The rise of the term bullying seems to be at the moment when it became sort of less possible to talk about racialized and gender-based and transphobic violence or harassment. It seems to be a proxy or a sort of a more acceptable substitution for talking about harassment, which at least names some kind of more structural relationship of violence. Even a kind of, I've heard recently a term I hadn't known about before, relational aggression, which is often applied to girls, relationships with other girls in schools. We've got lots and lots of, changes in reproductive technologies, which are obviously kind of changing day by day and opening up all kinds of new possibilities, but no change, as Karine Lesnick-Oberstein puts it in her book, no change in the desire to have your own child. That sense of possession and ownership hasn't shifted. Of course, there's nothing new about environmental catastrophe that global warming kind of brings to the agenda, because, in the 1980s we had all the sort of concern about the arms race and nuclear arms race. Well, that's still around, clearly, with discussions about Trident or not and red buttons. And we have a kind of discussions about challenges to heteronormativity, but alongside that, the ways in which the sort of increasing legitimization of gay and lesbian relationships kind of are in forms that recruit those acceptable forms of partnership to state allegiances, the homo nationalism surrounding gay marriage. So things are, I suppose what I'm saying is, it seems to me that there are some developments, things have changed, but some of the same themes are kind of being reproduced in slightly different ways, as well as some new things. But one of the key things that's changed in the last 20 odd years, certainly in Britain, is of course the creation, a rise of a discipline that's called childhood studies. I mean, and maybe there's all kinds of interesting reasons why, we were talking yesterday about the sort of, in my small group at the end, about the sort of demise of women's studies and gender studies in this country, and why that might have been, and I suppose there's something about the institutionalization of childhood studies that's both something to celebrate and also something to reflect critically on. But I feel very positive about that too, that development. And I think now childhood studies, in my reading of the available sort of literatures, sort of very much addressing the question of the diversity of childhoods, how childhood functions across the local and global and globalizing sort of debates about globalization, that the sort of conflicts between child rights and childhood studies are sort of finding ways of having very fruitful conversations with each other now. That there's southern-based and post-colonial decolonizing bodies of knowledge now coming to the fore that connect very explicitly with childhood, the debates about children and childhoods, and the discussions about what disciplines there are in childhood studies. But there's a whole kind of discussion about, is it cross or inter or multi or transdisciplinary and so on, which I think have been taking place in a very interesting way in childhood studies. But I mean, as someone who's just moved from psychology to education, I find it very interesting that that education doesn't seem to be about childhood. I know education doesn't only happen in classrooms, and it's not only children who learn or are taught, but still I think that boundary between, well, maybe we can talk about that, what's happening in relationship between childhood and education. But we still need the critiques of traditional psychology, I think, in childhood studies and elsewhere. So that's one of the newcomers. And of course, there's been a lot happening in what's been called critical psychology, which of course is, again, different things in different places. If any of you have looked at this annual review of critical psychology that Ian Parker is the managing editor of. It's an open access online journal. I mean, they're having, I think it's now the second review that looks at critical psychology across the world, and so different in different countries. I mean, there must be about 130 different chapters on critical psychology in different countries of the world, and even that, of course, is an oversimplification and in danger of methodological nationalism and all of that sort of thing. And I think one of the things that's been very useful, obviously critical psychology, I mean the term was first popularized from the German kritische Psychologie, but it's not only had a sort of German and a sort of UK-US version, and there are some differences between those, but also other kinds of sort of more local traditions of critical psychology have become more visible, and I'm working with colleagues in Norway and kind of learning a lot more about the sort of everyday life model that kind of is a particular development of sociocultural theory and a particular methodological approach, and to studying the everyday detail of children's lives to very interesting effect. As an example, I bring that. It's better linked with migration and transnational discussions, and a lot more kind of going on in the sort of discussions as we had over the last few days between feminist analysis and gender, queer theory and so on with and around childhood. Not necessarily harmonizing the tensions, but bringing them into relief with each other. And I think for developmental psychology or critical developmental psychology, we've got all these kinds of discussions going on. The turn to affect after the discursive turn, the rise of sort of this new discipline, psychosocial studies, discussions of embodiment that have taken up very interesting ways in Rachel Burke and Judith Duncan's recent book, which is a comparison between Japan and New Zealand in early childcare practices. Really, really interesting book. We've got the critical disability studies, reformulating notions of interdependency and dependency, and away from notions of the competent, of the overvaluation of competence. Posthumanism, not only the Deleuzian and actor network kind of theory versions, but the sort of, I would say that I favour the Haraway versions that reconfigure that and critically interrogate how that the boundary between the child and nature and culture, child and animal, etc., have all been come to acquire the meanings that they have and what else they could be. Very much linked then with the post-colonial critiques and discussions about decolonization and linked with ecological and sustainability issues. So I think these are very interesting and resources that weren't around 20 years ago, or certainly didn't have the circulation that they clearly do now. And in terms of discussions about childhood studies and childhood rights, we have, I think, lots of developments of the discourse of rights that are kind of pressurizing the claims around rights to sort of children's rights to communication that aren't simply about access to various forms of media, but are about the right to be given the space to make those views heard. As an extension beyond participation to be part of the negotiations. I think the sort of whole discussions, the articles in Children's Geographies, I mean that's a great journal, of course, too, Children's Geographies, which wasn't around 20 years ago. The discussions around children's rights in how they are researched is a very important discussion that has great relevance for developmental psychologists. There's a whole kind of strand of work that's attempting to deepen what we mean by studying children and study of children, the theories we use around thinking about children and childhoods, and resisting the pressure to come up with the sort of finished, complete, total kind of account, the lure of mastery in the fully developed, mature theory, as Gallagher put it, in the claims that we make for our research with and about children. So what I'd like to do now, just before I finish, there's a chair here if someone wants to sit down. Oh, better be careful. Want to sit down? Yeah. Is to try out an example on you of whether the arguments I've been thinking about work. So in terms of early intervention, well, we know that early intervention is very appealing politically, but we know it's kind of problematic in all kinds of ways, philosophically, politically, ethically. Philosophically, because we can't know what's going to happen in the future, and that's a problem with that, which means that those studies that try to predict do so on the basis of methodological approaches that only allow for certain kinds of knowledge. I'm borrowing this argument from a wonderful article by Jennifer Henderson and Denny. So it's constrained by what it is that can be known or is considered to be proper knowledge, which is methodologically. We have longitudinal studies in a way that we probably didn't have so much before, but it's focused around RCTs and neuroscience claims that suppress the diversity and creativity of development. And we know all these arguments that are said over and over again. This strips away context, context is socio-political, it's cultural, it's geopolitical. It resolves then back onto individual and family circumstances instead. That's what context becomes, focusing on what we can do to mitigate adversity. That's the discourse of resilience, what we can do to mitigate adversity rather than changing the circumstances that produce that adversity. And so, that's where we end up with this responsibilization process of putting the responsibility back for development onto children and parents, blaming the poor. So, you'll know all of this. The Allen report, brains and prosperity all linked up, but we only see the cost of the problems, and interestingly, so we have this link between child and national development that's visualized by these, brain scans with the gold bars. That's prosperity. And this is the cover of that report. You probably know it very well, don't you? The accumulation of the gold bars indicate the costs to the taxpayer. I think that's a very interesting sleight of hand, isn't it? Which are the social problems. They're labeled. You probably can't see this, but they're the social problems on those gold bars. And so the message is not actually about what the government's doing about these problems, but about what the costs are to the taxpayer. So I think it's some very interesting things going on in that. And there's been excellent work that sort of challenges that sort of neuroscientific spectacle and limits its claims and so on, and points out the slippages from minds to brains, from brains to national economies. What that does to the failure to understand the context for children's development, and how that links to these claims that are so prevalent around early intervention, that have great implications for the regulation of parenting, not only mothering, and poor families. And I've been very obsessed with this document for a while. You probably know it too, the Character and Resilience Manifesto that came out last year, and is still sort of resonating, reverberating on in various ways. so hence my interest in character and resilience, which of course displaces the responsibility from the context. It's actually all there in the picture, but with the focus on the children, not what they're navigating their ways or running their ways through in their competition. And the focus is on what they do, not what we do to help them, not what the focus on individual chronological time of their running rather than rather than this historical or political time. Their context is not situated in any way, and so on. What seems to get lost in the discourse of early intervention, this is the particular example I want to know if you think works, are the social and institutional conditions for children's lives, the relationships, the others that constitute the child, or in relation to whom those various other positions are constituted, as well as constituting the child, the children themselves, and that the child is addressed as an entity that it has to be not only moulded but also sort of fixed in the sense of improved or repaired in the service of what they will become, rather than, so this is the becoming argument, the critique of becoming, not the Deleuzian becoming, rather than what they are. So we know that kind of thing. But so it seems to me that this notion of early intervention performs a time trick. I've tried to write this out. Oh dear, I'm wrapping myself up here. That a particular vision or version of an outcome of what that is an outcome of what should or could be for an individual is being read back onto prior features or conditions of that person's life. That's one of the things that's going on, and it not only individualizes in the sense of stripping away relationships and contextual engagement, but it also identifies arbitrarily a contingent effect, something that could or could not happen with one or more of those prior features, and makes claims about a causal relationship. That seems to me that's what we're doing. It's what early intervention stuff does. And of course, this is a teleological approach that limits understandings of according to what that model is of where development is going. So this is very political. We've got a move going on from description to prescription, because the vision of what development is always from a particular place, with a particular perspective, with particular agendas and preoccupations. But the ideological character is masked, not intentionally, by this shift of temporal orientation. Because what seems to happen is that we move from the end, which is a possible end, not a necessary end, right to the beginning, and then try and read back from what happens on the way as somehow being necessary or relevant to that outcome. So instead of calling it early intervention, I mean, it's really earlier in the sense that there's a comparative going on between earlier and late, but that comparative is formulated in relation to a later that has already been specified before. So one of the things I want to know is whether that makes sense. And I have to read it, you see, and I can't read it from this either, as you can see. So that's kind of the work that seems to me to be part of the current project of the continuing project to Deconstructing Developmental Psychology. And apart from doing that kind of stuff, this is the kind of work I've been doing around, say, the educational impacts of the bedroom tax, with this report that please read and tell people about it. Trying to develop some work around supplementary schools as a way of offering another kind of perspective on pedagogical and schooling processes, and some work with a local environmental education network project on intergenerational action research, where young people are the teachers, along with adults who are community members as well as teachers and trade unionists, actually. Yeah. So, where are we up to? Is that enough time for some questions and discussion?
Great. So, if you'll join me in thanking Erica for that. Really wide-ranging presentation. It was fascinating. Thank you so much. So just, I wanted to, for new people who are coming into the room, that we are videoing today, so if you don't want to be videoed, don't ask a question or make a comment. It's probably the simplest way to do this. Just then to open up the floor to any questions or comments for Erica.
Do you want to use the microphone as well?
Yes. Then do you mind passing? Does somebody have a question or comment they'd like to start with?
It's really a comment of what you just talked about in terms of, I suppose, the time points of this idea of earlier, trying to somehow predict later but being earlier, and the way in which that sort of endpoint goal does not take into account all that might occur in between. And then I was just thinking about, I don't know, things like turning points or bifurcation points or ruptures or any of those other different ways you might conceptualize what occurs in between. That's, there's something I think about it capturing something in time and then not really doing a very good job of cumulative different experiences, everyday experiences as well.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Did you want to respond?
No, well, I just yes, I completely agree. I mean, the notion of the meaning of the term crisis is turning point, isn't it? It's certainly not linear, and we can't necessarily anticipate what its resolution or outcomes will be. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Erica. You've talked about so many things I don't know much about. But, are you sure that worry about nuclear arms in the past decades is the equivalent of worry about climate change today? And another is, are you against any kind of prediction or forward-looking?
Ooh. No, I'm not saying that worry about nuclear explosions and the arms race is the same as global warming, no. But I was just saying environmental concerns are nothing new. They each have their different, massive differences. And we've got nuclear worries now just as much alongside global warming, certainly. Am I against any kind of prediction? Oh, that's a really difficult question. I mean, we couldn't live without making inferences, could we? From day to day, and or with inductions, inductive generalizations. That's a form of prediction, isn't it? So it's not possible not to. But so what I'm worried about is some of the policy predictions and the particular forms that they take. And I mean, I guess the policies could make other kinds of predictions on the basis of other kinds of evidence, couldn't they? But in a way, your question kind of is a particular sort of acute version of the general question that gets posed to a sort of critique or a deconstructionist critique of sort of, are you saying this? You shouldn't have any of this kind of thing. Which is not what I would want to be claiming, but more that we just have to be critical about what we have, without saying we should abolish it all.
So what sort of forward-lookingness would you have?
Well, I think there's all kinds of ways of thinking about and reflecting upon the desire for futurity, and all kinds of ways of redefining development in less linear ways. And I don't have a direct answer to that question, but I think we need to be kind of mobilizing the kind of psychosocial studies, sort of disability studies, queer theory, are all formulating other ways of thinking about change, growth, development that offer alternative ways from the sort of RCT predictive studies of thinking about prediction. You're not convinced, are you?
I'm going to open up just so I know there's a few other people waiting, and we can take that up again later.
So in fact, my question in a way relates to this. So is it perhaps that, as I understood what I thought perhaps you were saying, was that you take any given possibly narrow prediction of what the future will be and use that narrow vision to interpret a complex present. And so is the issue not necessarily that we can't predict anything, but as I think you're saying, that in predicting, we are only predicting certain things, and that when we predict, we have to acknowledge the narrowness of those predictions and be very wary of how we then interpret the present through that lens. Is that the kind of thing?
That's beautifully put. Thank you. So I don't think the problem is with prediction. The problem is with what's being predicted, and on what base, and what isn't in focus to be talked about through the privileging of certain kinds of topics, which is another way of saying what you're saying. Yeah.
Other questions and comments? Maybe?
Well, it's only really, are you in the business of describing, or are you going to tell us in the end what would be better?
I
was thinking about the early nursery schools. We were looking at that book yesterday, 1906, and of course it was intervention, and it was aimed at certain things, this verbal kindergarten, but it offered a considerable amount of scope for the children to develop as they saw fit. And I mean, without wanting to ask you to be more positive than is possible, I mean, do you see any positives in the present socio-economic political situation in this country? Because we're talking about Britain, aren't we?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean,
the global influence is on Britain, but it's government policy and so forth that you're...
Well, I think, in terms of the project of the discourses of developmental psychology and early intervention and things, they're not only in Britain, and some of those discourses come from, the IMF and the World Bank and everything else anyway. Especially around things like, sort of development and intervention and active citizenship and so on. So I think that we need that broader sort of transnational perspective to understand why we've got these policies here and now in the first place. And in terms of sort of description, I think it's unsettling available descriptions that have acquired a kind of natural normalized status that's the project of been my project in some of the critiques of developmental psychology. I haven't been saying there's no such thing as can't envisage what a better developmental psychology would look like. I mean, I think that's another kind of project, but I. In the sort of more Foucauldian move, I'd want to sort of step back and say, well, the more sort of liberatory position is to stay close to current conditions and not preempt what could be. On another topic like the bedroom tax or something, I'm quite happy to be very prescriptive, as you heard yesterday. But so on particular issues. But in terms of a sort of a critique of developmental psychology, I think I'd want to stay at this kind of level. But that's not to say that other people might want to do something different. And I think there's lots of interesting things happening in that project of creating a different kind of critical developmental psychology or critical educational psychology. Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
Okay, yeah.
I was just wondering what you were saying with sort of the problems being located in the child, and sort of then it's the child that's wrong that needs to be fixed. Because I'm doing a doctorate in clinical psychology just round the corner.
Oh yeah.
And when I go to the clinic, then that's very much the case that I have with the parents. The parent comes in and says, "Oh, this is my child. Please fix them. They're wrong." But when I'm in the lectures, we're learning a lot about it's all parent training and multi-systemic therapy and looking at sort of the systems that the child are in, and actually working directly with the child as you would an adult doesn't really work that well. I've found, and I was just sort of wondering what your thoughts might be on that. Sort of why there's a bit of a mismatch.
A mismatch between the parents' demands and I think it's utterly understandable that parents should feel so pressurised by the available sort of parent blaming discourses that they want to see the problem all in the child. I mean, I'm a group analyst, so I do think systemically too. But if there's huge contestations going on then in the parental identities and the felt need to be a good enough parent. The kind of alongside all these other broader structures that, in a sense, that perhaps overdetermine how that demand of saying "fix my child." But it's good to hear that you're being trained in alternative frameworks that can help support the parents to think, but hopefully in a way that doesn't simply make them take responsibility for the problem and feel that all the problem is theirs, rather than situate it more broadly than that.
Yes, no, that's the trick, trying to sort of change them without them knowing.
Oh, well, no, that's a different thing. Quite a different thing. But, yeah.
I think we've got time for one last question or comment.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. But I was thinking about the word that you use many times about intensification and how people or like subjects or individuals are being intensified. And I can't help thinking that maybe early intervention is a kind of like a move forward from multi-agency work to intensify certain subjectivities to kind of like shape them. So it's not about like establishing sort of like a normative notion of how a child should develop, but now is how a child should kind of like reach an end point and what are the different stages. So I don't know if you see any links between this idea of intensified subjectivities or individuals and the move towards early intervention.
That's a very interesting question. Well, I think it's paradoxical in lots of ways because the early intervention moves aren't really interested in what children are like now because they're only interested in what's going to happen later, and it's that laterness that warrants the let's look at what's happening now. So it's a kind of I'm sure there must be a sort of visual metaphor for this. It's kind of a not looking that looks awry or something. So, in that sense, there really is. It's not the intensification comes from later, or And I think in that sense, the argument that Jan de Vos makes about the evacuation of subjectivity, I think is very prescient, very relevant. the discussions about intensification are really come from the sort of ideas about responsibilization, but also especially in relation to mothering practices, of how more and more has to be done sort of all the time, and more and more could, you know, that just competing, multiplying demands, pressures on what it is to be an adequate parent. It's not simply feeding and keeping them clean, etc., etc. It's not simply playing with them and talking a lot. It's even having the right kind of it's not even not drinking when you're pregnant, and or else you're going to get criminalized, or this. It's even having the right frame of mind all the time, and it's a total institutional sort of imperative. That I think that's part of what the discussions about intensification are about, and that's part of the sort of the neoliberal affective sort of discussions around what Ali Hochschild called deep acting, that we're required to perform certain kinds of affective emotional labor that goes beyond the kind of only the physical or even the surface performance, but is something we really, really have to feel intensely and genuinely and sincerely, and that's where the sort of self-exploitation and well, I'm sure we could find other words, comes about. So I think and of course children do acquire that too, because they are hailed into, interpolated into those positions and navigate them and appropriate them for themselves too. So so that could be used, those discourses or positions could be used in quite interesting and creative ways by children, but I think they are subject through those sort of strange temporal referrals and deferrals and retroactive constructions into those intensified positions. Children, will say this is the best, supposed to be the best time of my life, or they'll use those tropes, won't they? And they're very aware of what's going on.
Thank you very much, Erica. Will you join me again in thanking you?
Thank you.